It began in the late summer of 1977 in the quiet suburb of Enfield, North London. Peggy Hodgson, a single mother of 4, was struggling to keep her family together in their modest council house on Green Street. Life wasn't easy, but Peggy managed with her no-nonsense attitude and fierce love for her children. Margaret, 13, Janet, 11, Johnny, 10, and Billy, 7. However, the fragile peace of their home was shattered one fateful night when the unexplained began to unfold. The first signs were subtle, barely noticeable at first. It began with Janet complaining about odd noises in her bedroom. "It's the pipes," Peggy would respond dismissively. But Janet insisted it wasn't. The noises weren't random. They were deliberate, rhythmic knocks that seemed to come from inside the walls. One night, Janet and Margaret screamed for their mother, saying their beds were shaking violently. Peggy rushed into the room and found nothing out of place. Dismissing it as a bad dream, she told the girls to go back to sleep. But when a heavy chest of drawers slid several feet across the room with no one near it, Peggy could no longer ignore the situation. She tried to push the chest back, but an unseen force resisted her efforts. For the first time in her life, Peggy Hodgson felt real fear. She gathered her children and fled to the neighbors, Vic and Peggy Nottingham. Vic, ever the skeptic, entered the house with the intention of debunking the claims. However, he too heard the knocking sounds and witnessed a chair move across the kitchen floor. "Shaken," Vic suggested, calling the police. 2 officers arrived the following evening. They were professional and skeptical, chalking the family's claims up to hysteria or stress. But as they sat in the kitchen interviewing Peggy, one of the officers witnessed a chair slide 4 feet across the floor. The officer examined the chair and floor for wires or any mechanism that could explain the movement, but found nothing. Despite witnessing the phenomenon, the police concluded that no crime had been committed. "This is not a matter for the police, ma'am," the report stated. "We recommend you seek alternative assistance." Their recommendation led the Hodgsons to reach out to paranormal investigators, Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair from the Society for Psychical Research. Gross and Playfair arrived at the Hodgson home skeptical but curious. They began by interviewing the family, particularly Janet, who seemed to be at the center of the activity. Janet described feeling as though something was watching her all the time. "It's in the shadows," she whispered, her voice trembling. The investigators set up recording equipment, cameras and motion detectors to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. What they documented over the following weeks defied explanation. Chairs tipping over, toys flying across the room, and even an iron fireplace wrench hurtling across the kitchen. The most chilling evidence, however, came in the form of voices. Janet began speaking in a guttural, gravelly tone that did not match her young, feminine voice. The voice introduced itself as Bill, claiming to be a former resident of the house who had died of a hemorrhage in the living room. When questioned, the voice provided details about Bill's life and death that were later confirmed to be true. Even more astonishingly, doctors examined Janet and determined that her vocal cords were not capable of producing the voice naturally. The media soon caught wind of the haunting, and the Hodgson family became the center of a media circus. Reporters camped outside their home, hoping to catch a glimpse of the activity. Some journalists were able to witness phenomena firsthand, including objects moving on their own and loud knocking sounds. Not everyone believed the Hodgson family. Skeptics accused them of fabricating the events for attention. The pressure took a toll on Peggy, who grew increasingly defensive. "Why would I put my children through this if it wasn't real?" she asked during one particularly tense interview. Janet, meanwhile, became the focal point of the poltergeist's aggression. She was thrown from her bed on multiple occasions. Her hair was pulled by invisible hands, and she even levitated in front of witnesses. Gross and Playfair documented one instance where Janet was dragged up the stairs by an unseen force, her screams echoing through the house. As the investigators dug deeper, they discovered an eerie connection to the house's past. In the attic, Janet had found an old, worn doll. When Gross questioned her about it, she admitted that she had been playing with it just before the activity began. Through historical records, Gross discovered that a young girl named Abigail had lived in the house decades earlier. Abigail had died under mysterious circumstances, and her death was never fully investigated. The doll had been buried with her, raising the question of how it had ended up in the Hodgson attic. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to the case. Was the poltergeist the spirit of Abigail? Or was the doll a conduit for something more sinister? Desperate to end the haunting, Peggy agreed to a seance led by a local medium. Gross, Playfair, and a small group of witnesses gathered in the Hodgson living room one stormy night. Janet sat in the center of the circle, clutching the doll. The medium began to chant, calling upon the spirit to reveal itself. The room grew cold, and a deep, guttural voice filled the air. It wasn't just Bill this time. There were multiple voices all speaking at once. "You're not welcome here," one growled. "This is our home," another hissed. Suddenly, Janet began to convulse. Her eyes rolled back, and she let out a scream that didn't sound human. Objects flew across the room, and the lights flickered violently. Gross tried to reach Janet, but an invisible force knocked him back. Just as abruptly as it had started, the chaos stopped. Janet collapsed, unconscious as the doll crumbled to dust in her hand. The activity in the house diminished after that night. Janet slowly returned to normal, though she remained deeply traumatized. In later interviews, she admitted to faking a few incidents to appease the media, but insisted that the majority of the events were real. "You wouldn't understand unless you lived it," she said. Gross and Playfair continued to debate the nature of the haunting. Was it a genuine poltergeist, or was it a manifestation of Janet's unresolved grief over her father's death? They never reached a definitive conclusion. The house on Green Street still stands, unassuming and quiet. Its current residents report no unusual activity, but for those who know its history, it remains a chilling reminder of the unknown.